They prepared for battle, ready for wounds and even contemplating the possibility of death. But few American soldiers expected a day would come when enemy bayonets would herd them into columns of prisoners, stripped of weapons and freedom. Often, capture happened swiftly after grueling battles. When ammunition ran out and surrounded units were forced to surrender, raised on stories of honor and the Geneva Conventions, they held a naive belief that captivity might at least provide food, shelter, and hope for repatriation. This illusion shattered almost immediately. Guards barked orders in harsh foreign tongues and struck those who moved too slowly. The march began, and hunger set in as quickly as the chains that bound them. The first shock was not the prison gates but the denial of basic sustenance. In the initial days of captivity, some received only a ladle of watery soup or a piece of bread the size of a palm. Others got nothing at all, forced to march miles under scorching sun or pouring rain, passing the unburied bodies of fallen comrades left on the roadside. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the guards were deliberately starving them. Others clung to the hope that this was just the chaos of a transitional period. But as night fell and the stomachs of hundreds groaned in unison, a quiet fear gripped them. They realized that captivity meant not only the loss of freedom, but also the slow destruction of their bodies through deliberate deprivation. These men came from the farms of Iowa, the factories of Pennsylvania, and the suburbs of New York, where food was plentiful. In America, even during times of rationing, few truly experienced scarcity. Suddenly, they were treated as subhuman, forced to line up like cattle for food that wouldn't satisfy a child. The guards watched closely, sometimes mocking their desperation, sometimes ignoring them entirely. What shocked the prisoners most was not just the meager food, but the sense of indifference. This was not accidental but intentional neglect. Some soldiers tried to maintain discipline, forming ranks and dividing scraps equally among groups of 5 or 10. Others gave in quickly, hoarding crumbs or fighting over moldy bread. The strongest were not those with the most muscle, but those with the calmest minds. Those who could suppress fear long enough to devise a strategy. Yet nothing could hide the fact that their stomachs were consuming themselves. The human body can endure a few days without food, but when exhaustion from marches, lack of water, and empty rations combine, the toll is immediate. Witnesses later described the first days of captivity as a transformation. Soldiers who entered the war proud and confident withered within a week, their uniforms hanging loosely on shrunken frames. Some men began talking incessantly about food, recalling the taste of hamburgers, apple pie, or Thanksgiving dinners. Others fell silent, staring blankly ahead as if conserving energy for the next step. The bonds of military brotherhood faced a trial no training could prepare them for. Each day sapped more strength, and every stomach growl reminded them of a new, horrific truth. The battle for survival had just begun, fought not with rifles or grenades, but with sheer endurance against hunger. The march ended not with rescue or exchange, but at the gates of a sprawling camp, hastily built to hold thousands of prisoners. For the captured Americans, this place was both a relief and a nightmare. Relief came from no longer marching endlessly with blistered feet, surrounded by fainting comrades and constant fear of execution, but the nightmare lay in what awaited behind the barbed wire, overcrowded barracks, bare earth, and the grim certainty that this would be their new reality. The camp reeked of sweat and washed bodies and damp straw. Rows of wooden shacks leaned against each other, as if collapsing under the weight of human misery. Windows were boarded up, doors bolted shut, and armed sentries patrolled the perimeter with rifles at the ready upon arrival. Prisoners were lined up, searched for valuables, and stripped of anything that might offer comfort or aid escape. Cigarettes, lighters, knives, and sometimes even photos of loved ones were confiscated. The men felt even more exposed, robbed not only of freedom but of their very identities. Some were issued thin uniforms with prisoner numbers. Others were forced to wear their tattered combat gear until it fell apart. The barracks held nothing but hard bunks stacked 3 or 4 high with straw mattresses crawling with lice. Blankets were scarce, and in the cold months, men huddled together for warmth, their skeletal frames pressed against each other to fend off the chill. Yet the most shocking revelation came when food was distributed. Many expected that, once settled in the camp, rations would become more consistent, however modest. But the first meal confirmed their worst fears. They were given a single metal bowl of watery broth, sometimes laced with a few cabbage stumps or a handful of rice, and a crust of black bread that crumbled like dirt. The men stared in disbelief at what was supposed to sustain them. It was less than the field rations back home, less than the food they fed their dogs. Some initially refused to eat, thinking more might come later in the evening. But it didn't. By dawn the next day, the truth spread through the compound. This was not temporary. This was the rule. The camp's conditions mirrored its food supply, deliberately meager. Sanitation was nearly non-existent, latrines overflowed, and water was often limited to a single pump for hundreds. Diseases spread rapidly. Dysentery, pneumonia, and skin infections became constant companions. Guards enforced order brutally but offered no medical care beyond aspirin and occasional bandages. The camp was not designed to kill outright, but to weaken, to break men slowly until they became shadows of themselves. Soon, every prisoner learned the number that haunted them most: 600. This was the approximate daily calorie intake, as calculated by those who kept records or verified them with Red Cross inspectors. 600 calories, barely enough to sustain a child, let alone an adult soldier facing months or years behind barbed wire. As days turned into weeks, the prisoners adjusted to the rhythm of captivity, though never to the hunger. They woke at dawn, lined up for roll call, received a ladle of soup or bread, returned to the barracks, and tried to pass the endless hours. Some carved names into the wooden slats of their bunks, others kept secret diaries when they could smuggle paper, but all felt the constant drain of strength with each meager meal. The camp became more than a prison. It was a crucible where survival hinged not on combat skills, but on how long a body could endure starvation without breaking. The meager ration became an inescapable part of life behind the wire. At first, many prisoners thought the portions were a temporary measure, a supply error, or perhaps a punishment for new arrivals. But after a week, then two, the pattern became clear. Everyone received roughly the same: a crust of coarse barley or millet bread, often mixed with sawdust for bulk, and a bowl of watery gray liquid that could be called soup but was little more than water boiled with cabbage stalks or turnip leaves. Occasionally, a spoonful of rice or a scrap of horse meat floated in the broth. But these moments were rare and treated as miracles. Observant soldiers began counting calories, scribbling numbers in notebook margins or carving them into wood. The math was brutal: 500 or 600 calories a day, barely a quarter of what an adult soldier needed to maintain strength. At first, hunger gnawed gently, an inconvenience to be endured. But as days turned into weeks, the effects grew sharper. The body, deprived of fuel, began consuming itself. Muscles wasted, fat reserves melted, and energy levels plummeted. Soldiers who once carried heavy packs with ease now struggled to climb onto upper bunks. Those who stood tallest at roll call often stumbled first, their broad shoulders shrinking into bony angles. Food became more than a need, it became an obsession, the center of every thought. Conversations in the camp shifted. Men no longer spoke of battles, families waiting at home, or letters they hoped to send. Instead, all talk turned to memories of food and imagined meals. Some described in detail how their mothers baked pies or roasted turkey. Others debated the best way to cook corn on the cob or fry catfish. Recipes were recited like prayers, and imaginary feasts were planned with more care than any campaign map. For some, this mental exercise brought relief, a way to taste freedom through memory. For others, it was torture, sharpening hunger to an unbearable edge. The guards understood the prisoners' desperation and sometimes exploited it. At times, scraps were deliberately tossed on the ground to watch men scramble for them. Rumors sometimes spread that obedience might earn extra rations, though such promises rarely materialized. The prisoners quickly learned a bitter truth. Hunger was not a byproduct of war. It was part of the system, a tool to weaken bodies, crush morale, and remind each man of his powerlessness. The impact of a 600-calorie diet was not only physical but psychological. As the body weakened, so did the will. Men who once stood defiantly slumped during roll call. Arguments flared easily, fueled by envy over a crumb or a drop of soup. Yet, paradoxically, hunger also forged bonds. Some prisoners took their portions and divided them among small groups to ensure the weakest could survive another day. Half a crust of bread, shared between two, sometimes meant the difference between life and death. In these exchanges, humanity broke through the system's cruelty. By the end of the first month, the pattern was undeniable. Men grew thinner, sicker, quieter. Life's rhythm narrowed to a single calculation: could they survive another day on 600 calories? For some, the answer was yes, bolstered by camaraderie and memories. For others, the question grew graver with each dawn. Hunger became the camp's most relentless guard, needing no sleep, no rest, no mercy. The prisoners' steady decline soon became impossible to ignore. Faces once full of youthful vigor turned into hollow masks, cheekbones jutting sharply under dull, sunken eyes. Uniforms, already worn from battle, hung loosely, sleeves dangling over arms reduced to skin and bone. Each man seemed to age a decade in weeks. What began as fatigue turned into complete collapse for many. Some fainted during roll call, dropping like empty sacks onto the frozen ground. Others developed a shaky gait, their legs trembling under the weight of their fragile bodies. Hunger was not just hunger, it was the slow decay of the human body. Doctors among the prisoners tried to explain the process in whispers. 600 calories a day meant the body lacked the energy to sustain life. It burned fat reserves first, then muscles, then organs. Soon, vitamin deficiencies appeared. Without vitamins, gums bled and teeth loosened. Lips cracked, skin flaked, and infections spread unchecked. Beriberi swelled ankles and knees, making standing painful. Pellagra brought ulcers, rashes, and delirium. Night blindness crept in as vitamina vanished from their diet. The line between life and death blurred, and each sunrise felt like a small victory. The barracks themselves became infirmaries. Though without medicine or proper nutrition, recovery was nearly impossible. Those with dysentery weakened further from dehydration, while others wasted away from untreated fevers. Nighttime coughing often signaled tuberculosis. The sick lay beside the barely healthy, all equally hungry. Those with strength left tried to help, carrying the ill to roll call, fetching water, or spooning broth to those too weak to lift a cup. But even kindness came at a cruel cost. Giving energy to another meant losing it yourself. The camp's guards seemed indifferent. Sometimes they laughed at stumbling prisoners. Sometimes they simply ordered the sick to be dragged away. The lack of medical care was no accident. Prisoners learned quickly that survival depended not on their captors' mercy, but on their own endurance and the solidarity of their fellow inmates. Yet even solidarity could not defy the arithmetic of hunger. 600 calories a day was a death sentence stretched over weeks and months. Soldiers began tracking weight loss with grim fascination. A man who once weighed 80 kilograms might drop below 45 by the second month. Jawlines sharpened, ribs protruded, and hip bones pressed through thin layers of skin. The transformation stunned even the prisoners themselves when they caught glimpses of their reflections in muddy water or polished tin. They barely recognized the figures staring back, ghosts with dog tags, shadows of the soldiers who marched to war. Hunger ravaged not just their bodies but their dignity. To survive, some scavenged through garbage pits for discarded vegetable peels or gnawed bones left by guards. Others chewed grass or weeds, tricking their stomachs into believing they'd eaten. The line between soldier and beggar dissolved, along with the pride many carried into captivity. Yet beneath the humiliation, a spark remained. They were determined to endure, even as their bodies failed. The will to survive whispered that this nightmare would end. That liberation would come, and that, however emaciated, they would not let the enemy take their lives with hunger alone. As weeks passed, Months dragged on, and hunger seeped into the core of their consciousness. It was no longer just muscle weakness or stomach pain. Hunger became a constant companion, an enemy whispering from within. At first, soldiers tried to distract themselves with talk of home, baseball games, cars, or the girls they left behind. But gradually, all conversations turned to food. The toughest infantrymen, who once faced gunfire without flinching, now endlessly debated how best to fry chicken or how much butter a cornbread recipe needed. These weren't idle chats. They were an obsessive, manic longing, as if speaking the words could conjure taste. Hallucinations became another torment. Lying in dark barracks, soldiers swore they smelled bacon or heard steak sizzling on a skillet. Some reached out in their sleep, clutching imaginary forks. Others woke screaming, realizing their visions were only dreams. Emptiness warped reality. Hunger broke down the mind's barriers, leaving room only for fantasies of uneaten meals. For many, these illusions offered strange comfort. For others, they were unbearable torture. Psychological strain also manifested as despair. Once proud soldiers began to doubt anyone beyond the barbed wire remembered them. Without letters, without news, with only a bowl of watery broth each day, the thought of being abandoned gnawed at their morale. Some fell silent, retreating into themselves with eyes empty of resignation. Others lashed out, quick to anger over a crumb or a place in line. Fights over food often escalated, though strength allowed only feeble shoves. The camps stripped them of weapons, but hunger stripped them of patience, hope, and sometimes their very sense of humanity. Yet amid this bleakness, glimmers of resistance shone. Some men refused to let their spirits break, clinging to familiar rituals. In the evenings, they gathered in storytelling circles. Recalling holiday dinners at home as if they were sacred ceremonies, they carved imaginary menus into wood or dirt, listing dishes they swore to eat after liberation. These fragile acts of imagination gave structure to days that otherwise dissolved into torment. They reminded the men that guards could starve their bodies, but not easily crush a stubborn will clinging to survival. The weight of constant hunger also reshaped relationships within the camp. Close friends sometimes turned on each other, hiding scraps or accusing others of theft. But in other cases, bonds strengthened. Groups of men formed packs, dividing every ration equally, no matter how small. If someone stumbled at roll call, others propped them up. If someone fainted, others shared bread until they revived. In these circles of trust, hunger remained real but became bearable. Brotherhood in its simplest form became as vital as the meager food. By the end of each day, as stomachs clenched with emptiness and night fell heavily over the camp, silence spoke louder than words. Every prisoner knew 600 calories a day was not enough to live. The mind was forced to wage its own war. Resisting despair, enduring illusions, and sustaining a fragile hope that one day the gates would open, and they would walk out not as corpses but as survivors. Having endured hunger without surrendering their humanity, hunger turned men into skeletons, but instinct drove them to find ways to survive this merciless system. In the camps, desperation bred ingenuity. At first, these efforts were simple. Scraping every drop of broth from a tin, saving breadcrumbs in pockets to eat later when stomach pain grew unbearable. But survival soon demanded greater creativity. Some men crafted crude utensils from scrap metal, forging spoons and knives to extract every fragment from their bowls. Others learned to dry bread scraps on hot surfaces to harden them and prevent spoilage. Every morsel became precious and waste unthinkable. Barter became a lifeline. Cigarettes, though nearly as rare as food, became currency. A single cigarette could be traded for half a ladle of soup or a crust of bread. Non-smokers sometimes lived longer, hoarding their rations and trading them for calories. Items smuggled from Red Cross packages when they reached the camp were priceless treasures. A can of powdered milk, a chocolate bar, or a tin of Spam could be divided into dozens of deals. Each piece held the power to extend life another day. Guards sometimes intercepted these packages, keeping the best for themselves, but enough trickled through to create a small underground economy within the wire. Other strategies were riskier. prisoners searched for weeds or grass along the fence, chewing bitter stems to trick their bodies into feeling fed. Some even caught insects, swallowing beetles or larvae for a shred of nourishment. In the boldest cases, men slipped through weak spots in the camp's perimeter or bribed sympathetic civilians beyond the wire, trading trinkets for food. The risk was immense. Those caught faced beatings or worse. But hunger overcame fear. For a mouthful of rice or a boiled potato, men gambled their lives. Ingenuity extended to makeshift cooking. When possible, prisoners used discarded cans to build small stoves, burning wood scraps or cloth to heat water. They brewed bitter tea from weeds or made gruel from hard bread, which their weakened stomachs could better digest. These efforts didn't just nourish, they restored a fleeting sense of control over a life dictated by hunger. Sharing these creations in secret gave men not just calories but morale, reminding them that even in captivity, they retained some agency. In hidden corners of the camps, where soil and time allowed, they tried to grow small gardens. Seeds smuggled or salvaged from rations were planted in patches of dirt, yielding meager sprigs of green. The harvests were pitiful but provided vitamins absent from their diet and symbolized defiance of the camp's harsh conditions. These gardens, fiercely guarded, became emblems of hope, proof that nature still offered life in a place designed to drain it, yet no survival strategies could erase the harsh arithmetic of 600 calories. Each day was a battle between hunger and ingenuity, despair and defiance. Some men thrived in this underground system, stretching rations and sustaining themselves through trade and invention. Others, too weak or too desperate, faded quickly despite their comrades' efforts, but collectively, these acts of resistance ensured not all would surrender. Against the cruelty of deliberate starvation, prisoners responded with stubborn defiance, proving that even on the brink of death, the will to survive could spark ingenuity no captor could fully suppress. When liberation finally came, whether through advancing Allied forces or the collapse of enemy control, the world was forced to confront the evidence of what hunger had done to American prisoners. The first outsiders to enter the camps were stunned. Emaciated men, some weighing barely 90 pounds, stumbled on trembling legs to meet their rescuers. Sunken eyes peered from bony faces, rags of uniforms draped over skeletal frames. The photographs from those days showed not soldiers but walking reminders of deliberate neglect, images that became some of the starkest testaments to the cruelty they endured. Survivors carried more than physical scars. Many kept secret diaries, scratched onto book margins, scraps of paper, or even carved into wood. These fragile records told the story day by day, the exact weight of bread rations, the number of men who fainted at roll call, the tally of those who died in the night. One diary noted that daily intake never exceeded 600 calories. Another documented diseases directly tied to malnutrition. These records, smuggled past guards and hidden under floorboards or in clothing, later served as evidence at tribunals. They showed that hunger was not accidental but systematic. The Red Cross, which tried to deliver packages throughout the war, kept records of intercepted shipments and blocked deliveries. Their accounts confirmed what prisoners always knew: their captors deliberately withheld supplies that could have saved lives. Survivors, giving testimony, spoke of watery soup, moldy bread, and the constant hunger that clouded every waking moment. Doctors examining liberated prisoners corroborated their stories with grim medical details: severe muscle atrophy, pronounced vitamin deficiencies, and chronic organ damage caused by prolonged malnutrition. Some guards and camp officials faced accountability at post-war trials. Witnesses recounted how food supplies were diverted, how prisoners were mocked as they fought for scraps, and how deliberate policy ensured no one received enough to thrive. The figure of 600 calories appeared repeatedly in testimonies, cited as proof of intentional cruelty. In some cases, officers were convicted of war crimes based on these accounts. The world had seen many horrors of war, but the slow, methodical starvation of captive soldiers struck a unique chord. Violating even the minimal rules meant to protect prisoners, For survivors, telling their stories was a duty. Veterans organizations collected testimonies, published memoirs, and demanded recognition of the suffering endured behind barbed wire. They knew that without their voices, the dead would remain silent, their slow deaths forgotten amid the broader narrative of battles and victories. By testifying, they gave shape to an invisible war waged against their bodies and souls. Their words ensured future generations would see captivity not as an escape from combat but as another battlefield where survival was uncertain and cruelty constant. Even decades later, those who endured those 600-calorie days carried the memory in their bones. Many never shook the instinct to hoard food or clean every plate. Haunted by the fear of hunger's return, their stories, preserved in archives, memoirs, and trial records, remain a chilling testament to captivity. They bore witness not only to their own suffering but to the resilience that carried them to liberation. When the world finally saw the truth, long after the camps were emptied and the war ended, the story of 600 calories a day lingered in the memories of those who lived it. For liberated soldiers, it was more than a number, it was the measure of their slow starvation, a constant reminder of how close they came to death. Many carried those scars for life. Doctors noted that even decades later, camp survivors often suffered chronic digestive issues, brittle bones, and weakened immunity. The human body could not endure such deprivation without lasting consequences. But the invisible wounds were just as profound. Nightmares of empty bowls, sudden panic at the thought of scarce food, and a persistent instinct to save every crumb. The legacy of this hunger stretched far beyond individual memories. In the early post-war years, veterans groups and survivor associations ensured their testimonies were not forgotten. They published memoirs detailing the daily struggle to survive on rations barely sufficient for life. Trial records and tribunal rulings corroborated these accounts, preserving them in legal documents for future generations. The 600-calorie figure became more than a statistic. It was evidence of deliberate cruelty, a symbol of war crimes that blurred the line between battlefield and prison. Historians recognized its significance. In the decades after World War II, studies of prisoner of war treatment often returned to American accounts of starvation diets. Researchers noted how systematic food deprivation was used as a tool of control, designed not to kill outright but to weaken, demoralize, and strip men of dignity. The contrast with the Geneva Conventions was stark, showing how far captors were willing to go in flouting international rules. For many, the story of these rations became a vivid example of the gap between wartime theory and reality. Memory also shaped culture. At veterans' reunions, food often took center stage not just as sustenance but as a shared ritual of survival. A simple meal of bread and soup could bring tears to men who remembered when it was all that kept them alive. Some survivors found healing in speaking to students, warning younger generations about the fragility of human rights in wartime. Others never spoke, burying their memories, but their silence testified to the depth of their trauma. Families noticed habits: fathers who never threw out a crumb, grandfathers who grew gardens as if ensuring hunger would never return. Over time, the image of starving servicemen became part of a broader narrative of human cost in war. Museums displayed photographs of gaunt faces and diaries filled with ration tallies. Memorials honored not only those who died in battle but those who wasted away in captivity. The phrase 600 calories became a symbol of a hidden battlefield in the war. They fought without weapons or tanks, yet stood firm against hunger and despair. Even today, historians and veterans' families continue to remind the world of what these men endured. Their suffering underscores the importance of upholding the laws of war, protecting the vulnerable, and remaining ever aware that cruelty can take many forms. Not every atrocity is written in blood. Some are measured in empty bowls and emaciated bodies. Thus, the story of American prisoners starving on 600 calories a day serves as both a warning and a testament, a warning of how low humanity can fall and a testament to the resilience of those who endured against all odds.